Right. Good afternoon, everybody. We've got a great lineup of people this afternoon joining us both online, as I've seen many people come online, and of course with the people who we've invited on our panel. We've unfortunately not been able to get some people. We'll get them at other times, but we've managed to get a really good group of people. We have Tim Genders from WAPA, many other hats too, which he'll speak to. We have Mortimer Hope, who was a former ICASA regulator, also representing GSMA for many years, and now running his own consultancy, GH Communications, working with people on spectrum policy advisories. So lots of insights there from him. Alan Knott Craig, who's probably best known amongst some of you anyway for Project Isizwe, the very successful Tshwane Wi-Fi project that initially operated under the ANC Metro in Tshwane before its unfortunate demise, but now also looking at rural broadband connectivity. We have Carlos-Rey Moreno, who many of you will know from Zenzeleni, the fabulous community networks project, which was the hope for many other community projects in terms of scaling it up across the country and the continent. He also represents APC here. We have Steve Song, who many of you will know with many hats, and also from his fabulous blog, Many Possibilities, who's a researcher on shared spectrum currently with the Network Startup Resource Center, and also a part-time fellow with Mozilla Foundation, under which he does a lot of this work too. So we thought that this would be an important webinar to have now, because COVID-19 has brought into such stark relief the impact of digital inequality on people's lives, on their livelihoods, and even their survival now. As a small elite group of South Africans have moved their businesses, their schooling, their food orders online for the past 8 weeks, stringent lockdown, and it's brought the economy nearly to its knees, most South Africans have not been able to spend these long periods of time online, filing business rescue forms or unemployment insurance claims, or even just receiving their pensions or child grants online. Some have not even been able to log on to the National COVID-19 Information Center to identify where they could get food. I think if there's one positive thing out of this horrendous situation, it is the consensus that we cannot go back to the way things were. It is going to be much longer project, national project, to deal with some of these structural inequalities that underlie digital equality in South Africa. But some of the intersectional inequalities that leave around half of our population offline, and a vast proportion of those online, barely online, passively consuming tiny bits of data while others are actively consuming and even able to produce and prosper online, can be partially addressed by reducing the cost of broadband access, enabling free aggregated public Wi-Fi. So I think that there are strategies that we can address in the short term, although the longer term we will have to address these really big demand side challenges that we face. But even with these limited supply side interventions, the citizenry can be better placed to harness the digital lifelines in the next disaster or the next wave of this disaster, which does seem rather inevitable. Critical to this is reviewing the policy and particularly the implementation failures that have placed us in a far more dismal situation that we might have been had we stuck to the broadband plans envisaged in the National Development Plan and the operationalization of it in SA Connect. If we'd even met half those targets, we would have all had public buildings connected to broadband with free public Wi-Fi at everyone. We would have completed a market review that would have dealt with the dominance of MTN and Vodacom in the market, required wholesale access and the remedies to that for other networks. It would have introduced multiple new players into the market and it would have driven down prices. If we'd released the high demand spectrum 10 years ago to make possible the optimal use of 4G spectrum, that would have reduced prices and inputs and operational costs for operators. All of these factors might have had us perform better than we do against other lower and lower middle income countries that enjoy much higher penetration levels than we do. Similar countries that enjoy much higher penetration levels in Latin America, for example. But the truth of the matter is that even if we had regulated regulated competition effectively, and prices were lower, there would still be large numbers of people unable to afford mobile data services. Addressing this challenge must mean that we have to do things differently. We have to find different complementary business models, licensing regimes, surely. All this will require a larger digital integrated strategy to provide the necessary public and private coordination to deliver these public goods if we're going to have different outcomes. But in the short run, we have to take these more experimental opportunities to deploying low-risk policy and regulatory strategies, particularly in response to the challenges posed by COVID-19. The state has shown how agile it can be with the correct political will to manage this crisis that the pandemic has created. Within weeks of a ministerial directive to the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa, the regulator, to release additional spectrum to deal with the upsurge demand that we saw for bandwidth during COVID-19 lockdown, ICASA, the regulator, issued or assigned spectrum to 17 of the 35 applicants that complied with the provision of their temporary spectrum invitation. And that's something we want to come back to. The dominant players in the market, MTN, Vodacom, were granted spectrum in all the available bands, with Telkom, Liquid, and Rain being given some additional spectrum to supplement the legacy spectrum in these bands. Unfortunately, we don't have Peter Zimri from ICASA, who was going to be with us here. But Senka, you're a research fellow at Research ICT Africa and participated in our brief, or helped us put together our brief on this issue. Won't you just tell us a little bit more about the ICASA process to fill people in things? Peter's not here, what bands were released and what some of the outcomes were. And perhaps just go on to tell us a little bit about what RIA's view of this was.
Sure, thanks, Alison. So soon after the South African government announced the state of national emergency, the Ministry of Communications and Digital Technologies announced that ICASA would make additional radio spectrum available so that the mobile networks can keep up with the additional demand during the lockdown. And yeah, like Alison said, out of 35 applications that ICASA has received, only 17 were complying with the very narrow terms of the application process. And also these temporary arrangements have somewhat overshadowed the ongoing process of the permanent release of the high demand spectrum, which was, so the hearings were planned for April 2020. But the bands that were released are essentially the same, like those in the policy directive from last year. Those are 700 and 800 megahertz bands, plus 2.3 gigahertz, 2.6 and 3.5 gigahertz. And it was essentially the incumbent operators that got the spectrum. So Telkom, Vodacom and MTN, also Rain and Liquid Telecom. Apart from those, there were also 3 TV whitespace operators that got a license. But yeah, essentially, besides these 3 new TV whitespace service providers, we don't really have much foundation to expect that something will change, because
thank you, Senka. Senka, thank you. Mortimer, as I said, you've spent time as a regulator, spectrum regulator in South Africa, with the big GSMA association, big industry association, and now advising clients on digital spectrum policy. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you think ICASA could ensure that rural underserved communities are addressed during this time. I know you've been particularly interested in working with people on dynamic spectrum.
Yes, I'd like to start by congratulating ICASA on moving quickly to license the spectrum after the South Africa moved into the state of emergency. So some of us have been waiting for over a decade for ICASA to license that spectrum, and we saw that within a matter of weeks, they were able to license the spectrum. So when they want to, they can move quickly, and that's very good to see. What is concerning, though, is that the way the invitation was structured, the short time frame to respond, it had the feel as if it was designed to give the spectrum to the incumbents. So I think ICASA missed an opportunity to widen the pool of operators. They could have done more to bring more newcomers on board, and also they had the opportunity to impose coverage obligations. Now, in all the press releases that I've seen about the assignment, I did not notice anything about coverage obligations. We know from the CSIR's broadband gap analysis, that report, which was done in November 2018, that there are certain provinces where there is a huge gap, especially a huge coverage gap, especially in rural areas. So those provinces are the Eastern Cape, Limpopo, Northern Cape, and KwaZulu-Natal. So my view is that ICASA should have used this opportunity to, when assigning the spectrum, especially the lower band frequencies, such as the 700 and 800 megahertz band, they should have imposed some coverage obligations and made it necessary for the operators to deploy in those unserved areas. Another area that they could have done better is with TV white space. ICASA published the TV white space regulations over 2 years ago, but to date, there's no commercial deployment because of some other process that ICASA needs to complete related to the database. 2 years is too long to finalize that, and I think ICASA needs to get a move on. That, yes, it's nice to have the mobile operators providing LTE to the built-up areas, and I must say that it was very heartening to note that 5G was launched within a few weeks of the Spectrum Award, and they must be congratulated for that. But that's also contributing to the digital divide that we face in South Africa, because those who have broadband are getting more, and those who don't have are still without, and they're crying out for more, for broadband connectivity. Now, one way of addressing the broadband coverage gap is spectrum sharing. We have 2 national mobile broadband networks, MTN and Vodacom. The other operators, they have networks that cover mostly the urban areas. We even have 2 of the operators who roam on the networks of Vodacom and MTN. Now, their spectrum is unused in large parts of the country. And my proposal is that they should make that spectrum available to anyone else who wants to use it. And this could be done similar to the arrangement in the UK, where anyone who wants to use IMT spectrum can use it on a secondary basis. So I think that's something we need to explore in South Africa. We need to firstly test whether it's possible or how it can be implemented, and then put the rules in place to allow this to happen. So thanks very much. I'll pause there.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you very much, Mortimer. Tim, you've also had license interests using unused spectrum. You represent WAPA, number of small players who apparently unsuccessfully did apply for licenses in this round. I see there's a question, there's a statement or comment from Charlie Lewis in the chat saying that, you know, it might, in the midst of a global crisis, it might not be the best time to introduce new players into the market. But for precisely filling these gaps, the unused rural spectrum, the unused secondary spectrum that Mortimer was speaking about, creates opportunities for complementary services that can move much more quickly and meet demand during this crisis and post this crisis. I just wonder if you could address that question while you tell us about some of the initiatives that you were hoping to realize under the temporary licenses.
Thanks, Alison. Yeah, it was very interesting getting the invite from ICASA to apply for that spectrum. We actually had some meetings with Mortimer beforehand, and I felt like Aladdin, and Mortimer was the genie coming out of Aladdin's oil can lamp. That's right. Yeah. And Mortimer saying to me, you know, you could have whatever wish you like for spectrum. As our members, we were very, very interested in the 3.5 gigahertz, simply because there's a lot of very reasonably priced equipment out there. And very similar concept to the Wi-Fi, the open spectrum. And we put it out to the members, would you like us to go for the 3.5? And surprisingly, the answer came back as rather not. And the reason why was because once you get spectrum, you need it for life. The costs of moving customers off spectrum that you're using can end up being far more than the gains that you got by putting them on that spectrum in the first place. So having had the sort of three wishes for spectrum, we actually stepped back and said, look, the place where we need spectrum the most is in the 5.9 to 6.1 gigahertz. For the simple reason is that most of our members, and we've got about 200 members that have wireless networks across the country, they've got equipment out there that all it is a configuration change on those radios to make them use those extra frequencies. And the challenge, so in terms of delivery, it was literally an overnight configuration. So we applied for that spectrum, and we were quite disappointed from the response from ICASA in that it was no response at all for a number of weeks until we really rattled on the door. And then we were basically not being given that spectrum, which was a real shame, because with the extra, the networks were showing an increase of usage of 30% in peak time to 100% in normal daytime. And we needed that spectrum, but it was very disappointing that ICASA really just focused on the big players, as Mortimer said, and decided to not really address the opportunity of the smaller players that WEPA represents, the 200 members that we've got. And really what we saw is a very contrasting policy to America, where the FCC have an approach of liberate as much spectrum as you can to as many people as possible, and let innovation happen. So yeah, we were disappointed that the small business players were not looked after in this COVID disaster.
Thanks very much, Tim. Carlos, you, as Zenzeleni, I think lots of people were surprised or maybe didn't understand why you didn't apply for temporary spectrum. But you also have spoken about you simply don't have the resources to set up or extend networks or even maybe even reconfigure for a short period of time like that. And one of the questions that we've raised, or one of the issues that we've raised in the brief that we did was, perhaps there should have been temporary licenses in order to test and experiment what was viable and possible, but with at least some prospect of extension where they weren't going to conflict with, with other licenses. I wonder if you could speak about that, and also just more generally about your your interest and your passion around extending IMT spectrum more, to the benefit of all South Africans.
Thank you, Alison. And very much the answer is aligned with what Tim said, right? It doesn't, you cannot, even if, I mean, if a commercial one cannot do it, a non-for-profit one in areas with so little income, how do you recoup that investment in 6 months? Is totally impossible. Besides the type of commitment that Zenzeleni does with the communities, if you do that and then they take away the spectrum, how do you explain it, right? Like, maybe people need to get phones that need to operate in that particular spectrum, and if it's for 6 months, it doesn't quite make sense, right? But it's not only, it wasn't only a question of price and a question of community involvement. There was the regulations per se. You required an individual license for both infrastructure and services, right? So you were excluded from the onset, as most of the WAPA members, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is also, it's not a question of these COVID-19 regulations. It's also related to what Mortimer was talking about at the beginning. I mean, most of the 1,800 licenses were given away, were authorized in 2009. I mean, that coverage map that Mortimer is talking about, it could be released and see who is, and be released under an open data license and see who is operating that spectrum where. But I've done my own, I'm a telecommunications engineer, I've done my own spectrum analysis, and in the rural areas where Zenzeleni operates, there is no usage in 1,800. None of the 6 operators use 1,800 in rural areas. And that was given away 10 years ago, 11 years ago, right? So for me, like going forward, not even within the COVID context, but going forward, what can be done and what needs to be done so that doesn't happen again. And Mortimer was talking around the very interesting regulations that Ofcom has into place. In South Africa, there are spectrum regulation provisions, but those require that you have a spectrum assignment before sharing it, right? So either you get that spectrum assignment or you cannot share. So you can only share with those that have a spectrum already, and then wish that ICASA gives you a license, and a spectrum license, but they cannot give you a spectrum license because it's high demand spectrum, and high demand spectrum can only go out via an invitation to apply. Therefore, you are locked. So the radio regulations need to change in order to, I mean, spectrum sharing is the way forward. There is no other way for efficient spectrum management. It's happening in the UK, it's starting to happen in the US. We are seeing more and more claims about the spectrum sharing and about dynamic use and efficient use of that spectrum that is not being used where it's most needed the most, although it might not make commercially sense for the bigger players. It makes sense as a public good that belongs to the government and has a public service goal in itself, and that is not used for that purpose, and there are mechanisms. The first mechanism is changing the radio regulation and allowing a spectrum sharing in a way that is feasible. And because at the moment, not even, I mean, Zenzeleni has been trying has been talking to Celsi, has been talking to Rain, has been talking to Liquid, has been talking to Telcom around spectrum sharing agreements. And first of all, they say no, or they never answer. Second of all, if they say yes, there is no framework to do that, right? So yeah, I think that's the main point, and that would be a killer for rural South Africa. Zenzeleni with Wi-Fi, that not everyone has a Wi-Fi device, last month had 20,000 rand in income in places where has been deemed totally unprofitable for pretty much anyone. So imagine if you could get to the mobile handset of the individuals that really need that connectivity, and the only thing that you need to get there is the spectrum that is unused. So there is something that needs to change. There is something that needs to change, but I'm going to leave it there.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Carlos. Alan, perhaps you could come in there. As I said, having been probably best known, or amongst your many hats you've worn, was the success of Tshwane Wi-Fi, very much a metro arrangement, public Wi-Fi arrangement. Now you are focusing your efforts on cost-effective rural connectivity. Could you tell us a little bit about what your ideas are about that and how you might have been able to use temporary spectrum, or whether you face the same problems as other players who don't already have licenses?
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Alison. So I would concur with what Carlos and Tim have been saying around, taking spectrum on a temporary basis is a bit tricky when it comes to making capital decisions. I'll just speak from my own experience around the rural stuff. So let me start by saying that I don't believe in licensed spectrum, because it just seems irrational to me, a lot of the rules, etc. So as a solution in the long term, it's not a solution. It's a short-term solution, perhaps. I do have a feeling that partitioning rural and metro spectrum doesn't really work, because there's not a lot more money in the metros, and the profits you make out of the metro should be used to subsidize the rural areas. I think perhaps if you said to a Vodacom that you can get spectrum for the whole country, but if you don't show at least 60% utilization on that spectrum for the whole country, we'll take the spectrum back. You will find that guys like Vodacom and MTN actually will change their pricing according to rural versus metro, because they'll get the volumes in the metros anyway, but unless they drop their prices in rural, they won't get the volumes there. And if they don't have the volumes in rural, they lose their spectrum in the metros, which is where they make their money. In my opinion, the ISM bands are working fine. I mean, we have a business that is focused on rural South Africa broadband, and it's absolutely fine in terms of just using unlicensed spectrum for the last mile. But I don't think that really works in congested areas like townships, effectively. There's just not enough space in the air. So ultimately, it's going to be a fiber to the home solution for that type of thing. It's not going to be a spectrum solution.
Alan, could you just talk a little bit more about the fiber to the home costs and the changing fiber to the home costs compared to mobile broadband? I think for a long time people thought that fiber to the home simply wasn't affordable, and obviously getting it to the home is still costly, but the cost and quality once one has connectivity is now considerably lower. Is that right?
Yeah, I come from a household which said that wireless is going to take over the world, forever. But if you look at the arc of the history of telecoms, it kind of started with this wired world, telegraph, and then fixed line, copper, ADSL, and then mobile just took over. But fiber really, is now becoming the kind of medium for that most first world countries are using for most connectivity. The vast majority of data is running across fiber, with Wi-Fi as the last little inch inside the house. The reason for that is just unit economics. It's just literally it's an order of magnitude cheaper to connect one house to the internet versus roll out a network that has to cater for thousands or millions of people all connecting to mobile base stations. And especially in a South African context where your actual infrastructure costs are compounded by, you have to have your own electricity grid effectively. You can't rely on Eskom. You have to have batteries, which are very valuable for a lot of poor families, and solar panels, which are also very valuable. So you've got massive kind of extra additional costs that you've got to layer on, and security costs and replacement costs and insurance costs. And the fiber solution kind of solves one of the bigger problems for fixed line, in the sense that the old days when we used copper, that was quite valuable, so a lot of it gets stolen, whereas fiber has no resale value. So you've kind of got away from that. Fiber doesn't have any electricity requirements, so you don't have to have batteries and solar, and you can I think the big turning point on fiber was when people realized you don't have to put it in the ground. Just to give you an idea of the economics, it's about 10,000 Rand per home passed in a kind of standard issue leafy suburb to trench fiber. But if you were to just do aerial fiber, it's about 1,000 Rand. So a 90% reduction in capex is a big number. And a leafy suburb is far less densely populated than a township. So you could probably fit 3 houses onto a normal kind of leafy suburb house. So you can divide your cost to connect by 3 if you're going to do a township fiber. So, the unit economics of fiber have completely transformed in the last few years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've seen that in Mozambique, where the aerial fiber just really turned that market on its head and presented enormous competition to the incumbents. Steve, you've actually transversed all these areas over the many years that you've been lobbying for more innovative use of spectrum, more optimal use of spectrum, and indeed, you know, often adopting a commons approach amongst your multiple approaches to the sort of more demand side valuation of the spectrum, realizing that the non-commercial value of it, not just the supply side value that's been attached to auctions and those kinds of things. I'm wondering if you could just tell us about what you think of these assignments. Of course, we do have the 3 TV white space licenses, which I think are long awaited, and people believe it's a good use of the temporary spectrum, and hopefully they would be allowed to continue afterwards. It seems a bit pointless otherwise. But I wonder if you could share with us what you think about that, and potentially what other opportunities were missed here.
Sure. I think to begin with, it's a very difficult thing to do, to issue spectrum on a temporary basis, as some of the earlier speakers have alluded to. And is it okay if I just go into some of the details of some of those assignments and the challenges they represent? So I think the most obvious and immediate benefit of any of the spectrum assignments are those operators who have spectrum and who get more of it. That's a bit like having a highway where some of the lanes are blocked with pylons, and it's just a case of lifting up the pylons, and instantly the highway gets wider. So for instance, Telkom in 2.3 gigahertz had 60 megahertz, they got 20 megahertz more. Fantastic, instant boost for all of their subscribers. So they're same with Rain in 2600 megahertz, an instant expansion of their capacity with virtually no investment, additional investment on their part. That's great. That can work on a temporary basis or a longer term basis. I mean, it can be done easily, and its impact is immediate on the subscriber base. The next best thing is operators who have equipment that can be adapted to purpose. So Vodacom have claimed that in the, I think it was the 800 megahertz band, they have equipment that could be turned on in those frequencies, and so there is relatively low hanging fruit in terms of being able to, it's a bit like widening the road. And so there are benefits there. However, are there any short-term benefits? Because, if you turn on a new frequency, most, if not all of your subscribers are going to need new handsets. So, the benefits are those people, are going to need handsets that can support 800 megahertz. So short-term benefits, I'm not sure, and then, come November when these licenses expire, there's a kind of implied commitment. You've had your cup of mint tea with the carpet seller, in that you're already engaging in a transaction which may have an impact on the auction, subsequent auction process. And then, further up in the sort of 3.5 gigahertz, this is obviously a push towards 5G and, trying to, I see MTN announced this morning, they were launching 5G services, which as Mortimer pointed out earlier, this is not going to reach the unserved. So in terms of all of these assignments, there have been, I think you've seen, some immediate relief to existing networks that have been overloaded in capacity. But, in terms of reaching the unserved, this is not doing anything in particular. And I think the key to changing that, TV white space spectrum and accelerating the regulation around TV white space spectrum is excellent. And it's great to see South Africa, both the CSIR and ICASA leading in that regard. However, TV white space is a great backhaul technology, or a great rural backhaul technology, which is fantastic, but it doesn't reach handsets. So then to get to the handset, you're probably going back to Wi-Fi, which, as Carlos has pointed out, in rural areas, not everybody's phone is going to be able to do that. So once again, we're stuck with this issue of how to reach the unserved through the release of new spectrum. And I think the answer has been alluded to earlier. It's through sharing. And I think the key to that sharing is, and Mortimer mentioned the new licenses that Ofcom have introduced, the local access license and the shared access license. But what makes those licenses possible are the existing IMT licenses held by the big operators, which carry very, very explicit non-exclusivity clauses. Now you can call it non-exclusivity, or you can call it use it or share it, but it explicitly states in the assignment of that spectrum that the regulator reserves the right to make other decisions about that spectrum while guaranteeing non-interference for the primary spectrum holder. This is the key. This is how we unlock all the other possibilities in terms of the release of that spectrum. Mexico has done this with their new licenses. The UK has, and it is essential, I think, to any new licenses. So, you know, if we talk about what is the lobby point, you know, for civil society in talking to ICASA about all the auctions, inserting that one clause into the licenses that are issued is the beginning of a conversation about unlocking access to LTE spectrum in rural areas. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Steve. David Johnson, you've worked extensively with CSIR on the TV white space, on the WERN, on all sorts of spectrum aspects, and of course at GCT's ICT for D Center as well. Before you tell us a little bit about your Ocean View project, your efforts for a metro community connectivity that your network that you established there, I wonder if you just talk a little bit about the TV white space, the issue of devices, and the challenge of integrating that if it's not just being used for rural backhaul.
Great, yeah, thanks, Alison. And I think first off the bat, it's important to kind of differentiate TV white space technology and then the use of TV white space spectrum. Because, so, you know, if we look at TV white space spectrum, which is sub 1 gigahertz spectrum, I mean, the places where that can be used, I've done some studies that show sort of between 5 and 500 people per square kilometer. That's kind of the sweet spot. And the number of people that could serve in South Africa is sort of around about 40%. The real sweet spot of TV white space is somewhere around 13%, but then sort of around that there's kind of mixed options one can use. But the thing is, TV white space technology in those areas is actually quite old and ossified. I mean, the technology that you'll find from Adaptrum and Carlson Wireless, this 802.22, 802.11 AF, is really old technology and has become quite outdated. But I mean, I take my hats off to those companies, because they kind of, with very low volumes, have had to survive and keep building this equipment that's now going to be used in these trials. And maybe this is a bit controversial, I actually believe that LTE in TV white space may even be better technology than some of the current TV white space technology being used. So, and to use LTE technology in TV white space wouldn't actually be too difficult. One can repurpose a lot of that equipment, use a spectrum database, and have LTE working in current TV white space, or even in 700 and 800 using a spectrum database. And the way I see it is, what we did with TV white space was kind of like, and I like these kind of analogies that Steve always come up with, these nice metaphors, is, you know, for maybe decades we were stomping the mud of an old-fashioned spectrum use that sort of comes from the wireless telegraph days and making the ground very hard in this kind of exclusive license type of model. And now we've taken a pick at this hard ground with TV white space and sort of opened the soil a bit. And I think it's really just the gate opener, TV white space, to what I think is going to be a much more exciting world of spectrum sharing in the cellular world, where that's where I think we're going to plant the trees in the loose soil and really get the interesting things happening. So
Dave, thank you for the wonderful analogies building on Steve's. I'm wondering if you just want to take a minute or so to just talk a little bit about potential with urban community networks. Often they're thought of as rural, remote community networks, but perhaps just tell us a little bit about what you're doing with Ocean View.
Yeah, so about end of 2018, we seeded a community network in Ocean View. There's a cooperative that was formed, Ovicom Dynamic, that have rolled out a Wi-Fi mesh network across Ocean View. So this is a fairly small community where we're just sort of proving what's possible. And we're trying some interesting new ideas where we have this mixed model of access with vouchers to the internet with Wi-Fi, which is 20 Rand a gigabyte. And also access to a whole lot of local free services that we've hosted in the community. So we have the system we've called the Neti, which is access to file sharing, sort of social media, local free chat, and a lot of education resources, Wikipedia, TED Talks, Khan Academy, available totally free. So when you kind of land on the splash page, it says, here's a bunch of free services you can access. If you're doing your schoolwork, you can go to all these education resources, or click on this button and you get, enter your voucher and you get access for 20 Rand a gigabyte. It's fully community owned, so all the money stays in the community and goes to the directors of the cooperative. And we've had a lot of heartwarming stories of, some of the school kids using Zoom with this Wi-Fi network to access their teachers. And a lot of the zero-rated services are kind of not used that much. People need to access their teachers. It's not just about the zero-rated sort of access to Wikipedia. But the problem is this is just a few kids out of thousands, that because the Wi-Fi network is still limited. I mean, we know the range to the devices with Wi-Fi is limited. If we had a cellular base station using shared spectrum access in that township, thousands of school kids could have got access to their teachers and access to all the education resources. That what we were seeing now would have just been amplified hundreds of times. So we're really pushing for having a shared spectrum LTE base station using the sort of technology you can buy now from Baycell or Open Cellular, running there as soon as possible. I think we need to show the US that we can innovate. The US has innovated in, they've just released 6 gigahertz. They opened the gate in the early 90s with Wi-Fi and then TV white space. I think where Africa can lead, and South Africa can lead, is doing something really novel and new with spectrum sharing. And
great.
That would be super. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dave. I think we are getting a very clear message on what some of the conditionalities of certainly the longer term spectrum assignments need to have attached to them. I'm wondering on that note whether H. Sama Nwana, the former Ofcom regulator who I see is in the audience, would mind commenting on some of the really excellent points that have been made so far.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Look, thank you, Alison, and good afternoon all. I think we've heard some fantastic contributions from Mortimer to Johnson, Dr. Johnson just now. I've got maybe a few comments to make just on what you've heard. So first, I declare an interest that I've been heavily involved with leading a team to advise ICASA on their forthcoming Never Arrived auction. So let me just declare that interest. and then I would move on. But more importantly, from my perspective, I really want to say I did a piece which some of you have seen a month ago on imagine if this COVID-19 had happened in 2005, not 2020. And the reason I start my comments on that piece is because I just want to point out that the few of us who are on this call are those of us who have got access and those of us who can afford it. And that this should not be lost on a lot of our brethren and sisters across the African continent, particularly in South Africa. And as Mortimer was saying, particularly in regions of South Africa, like the Eastern Cape, Northern KwaZulu-Natal, and so really, really important. And even those of us here in the UK, we are counting our blessings that this happened in 2020. Those of us on this call should count our blessings that this happened in 2020 because we can now use Zoom. Back in 2005, we would not have been able to even have this fantastic call that Alison has arranged. Second core point I just want to make out of my 4 points is, look, I really think, I hope now most policymakers in South Africa, the ones I certainly talk to, I hope they're now waking up to the fact that human connectivity, online connectivity is a human right. It goes back to the inaugural in Durban back in 2012, in the city where you currently are in now, Prof. Alison, when he said, we the ministers responsible for information communication technologies in our respective countries in Africa, assembled in Cape Town, 4th to 7th June 2012, declared broadband communications a basic human right for Africa and commit to increasing broadband communication to at least 80% of the population by 2020. I guess they made those comments thinking 2020 was not going to arrive anytime soon. Sorry, we're in 2020. And we definitely are not 80% of the population across Africa. My third comment I'm going to make is, look, and everybody has said it on this call, for those people like me who have actually run spectrum policy in a developed country like the UK, I would just want to make the key point that if you consider spectrum policy to be a human right, then we need to change the way we run spectrum policy across the world. And I think COVID-19 has put this reality in very, very stark terms. It means, frankly, and this goes to what this call is all about, we probably need to experiment a lot more with spectrum policy than we've been prepared to do to date. It means, by definition, unlicensing spectrum should be the default position to move to. So you heard Dr. Johnson talking about what's happening in the US with respect to them releasing 1,200 megahertz or more spectrum for both very low power indoors as well as standard power. That must be the right direction to go. It means spectrum sharing must really, really be taken seriously in South Africa and elsewhere. Just see some of the things that we've just heard on this call in terms of using Wi-Fi within the ocean community, ocean waters community. Why shouldn't we be doing that? It means that the days of licensing spectrum nationally probably is gone, across Africa in particular. Licensing spectrum nationally doesn't make sense. If you look at where something like 2,600 megahertz spectrum is used in the UK, it's probably used in less than 6% of the geography of the United Kingdom, the last numbers I saw. It means that we need to move away from exclusive spectrum licenses. So these are some of the key messages which we have heard on this call, and I frankly just want to associate myself with most of those comments. But last but by no means least on my part, it really means that we need to encourage ICASA to do more spectrum innovation and do more regulatory experimentation. Don't be too scared about what has happened. What would happen with spectrum, particularly in rural areas? The sky is not going to come crashing down. It means we need to push back against some of the big guys about who want to be very precious with their spectrum in terms of holding it to only for exclusive use. I really just want to end my comments to say, look, South Africa has done okay in terms of what ICASA has just done. Let's not make okay the enemy of the good. So I give ICASA a lot of kudos on what they've done recently. Let's just encourage them to move to the good bit and eventually to start being one of the best regulators experimenting with spectrum policy in South Africa. Thank you.
Thanks very much, H. That very nicely summarizes us, the inputs for us, because I think we are running out of time. I did just want to give Pablo a chance to give us any of the moderated questions from the question and answers session. I think the last one from Dimitri is probably quite pertinent to what you've just said. Not just we're being innovative about how we think about this, not only in terms of the actual spectrum assignment and regulatory side of it, but also from the institutional arrangements, innovation, getting this really to meet the needs of the country as a whole.
We have a couple of questions, but of course I encourage anyone else on the audience to send theirs. We have the question from Dimitri asking whether we should consider a different departmental structure, whether the Department of Communications is enough to deal with this challenge, or whether we need a more holistic approach from the government. And then a question from Charlie Lewis wondering about the pilot for TV watch space was by DSA and any updates on that. But yes, we're still waiting, hoping to get more questions.
Okay, perhaps just because we've got a very, very few minutes left, I might just ask whoever would like to respond to those to do it. Otherwise, I will select someone. Would anybody like to respond to Dimitri's question about whether spectrum needs to be addressed at a kind of broader level of government, that it's not really just a sectoral issue any longer?
Mortimer kindly answered a question online about TV water space, but also if you want to do it.
Mortimer, would you like to just respond to that?
Let me unmute. Yes. So that trial that Charlie asked about, it's still in the planning stage. The most important part of the planning is fundraising. So PIP, Policy Impact Partners, and the Dynamic Spectrum Alliance, we've gone out on fundraising. The results are positive. So we just need to finalize an agreement with a potential funder. But parallel to that, we've also engaged with a number of entities. We started with ICASA. We've engaged with the existing IMT spectrum licensees. And what Tim said, I think it was Tim who mentioned that you speak with them about sharing their spectrum and they either ignore you or give you a runaround. So we're in that phase with them. And we've also engaged with the CSIR and potential partners. I also reached out to Tim on that, and the ICT SMME Chamber also, and some of their members. Then we've also engaged with potential vendors. So that engagement is ongoing. We cannot do anything now in terms of implementation because of the restrictions on movement. But once that is lifted, we expect that the project will then be launched.
Thanks very much, Mortimer. We're fast running out of time. Dimitri, I'm going to respond just by saying that, I think the broader issues of digital policy, global governance required for digitization and datification across the economy, the delivery of global public goods, really all require a non-sectoral approach. And I think, spectrum is very centrally wrapped up in that, in the kind of preconditions of connectivity, of affordable access. And I know that, the presidency is seized at the moment. I know everybody's like, oh, how has it taken COVID for people to actually, lash themselves on the issue of our failures to do certain things to date. But I think it is an opportunity for course correction, and clear the policy uncertainty, the policy flip-flops, the institutional conflict of interest, the suing of various state departments by each other, the deciding of where policy spectrum is best located, where the technical expertise is. So of course the broader, very high-level policy commitments should be part of a digital policy, but the actual implementation, the capacity to implement the policy is really and assign the spectrum, and it's within the allocated ITU guidelines. So it's really something that the technical regulator, increasingly combined into the spectrum regulator, combined into the other broader regulator, should be handling these decisions and being able, therefore, to move much more quickly. So we've seen that the delays, ICASA's actually often been ahead. Way back, ICASA was actually ready to auction the spectrum. It was flawed, better at that stage to get it flawed and corrected, which you could have done with spectrum trading, than to just have let it, gone on for 10 years. The opportunity costs for the economy have just been, enormous. Our failure to deal with the crisis has, really highlighted that. So I do think we have an opportunity. I think ICASA has shown that it can act quite swiftly and nimbly where it's got the political will, where it's supported by the political will. And I think the political will is there at the moment, and we have to grasp it while it's there, because we know how fragile that is and how it can dissipate. So I just want to thank you all very, very much for participating on this. Thank you very much to our experts, always so insightful. And we'll definitely be gathering these fantastic inputs and submitting them to various places. We're in discussions with the National Planning Commission. We're in discussions with various initiatives within the presidency, and certainly to put these before ICASA as well. There may still be time, even with temporary spectrum licenses, to do things, and there's certainly lessons to be learned for the next round of auctions, permanent assignments. Take care.